Hey everyone, and thanks for joining me. I'm Keith Anderson, founder and principal analyst at Decarbonizing Commerce, and I'm really excited to share with you today an introduction and an overview to why retailers and CPG companies are investing more aggressively in climate and sustainability action, and most importantly, how it's impacting the customer experience and ways of working. If you are not familiar with me or with us, I've spent my entire career in retail and CPG, about 2/3 as an industry analyst and advisor to predominantly large retailers and CPG companies, and about 1/3 of my career as a strategy and product executive at a venture-backed analytics company. Uh, so you may be wondering uh, how I find myself talking about sustainability, and you may be wondering how you find yourself listening to me talk about sustainability. But when I left the software company after it was acquired a year and a half ago, I took some time to go due diligence on trends that were really high velocity and likely to be high impact, but weren't yet on the radar of the industry in the commercial side of the business. So on no level am I suggesting that sustainability is new or that climate action in the industry is new. But as you'll hear me describe today, I do think that it isn't getting the focus that it's going to require over the next 3 to 5 years. And so with this firm, we are a membership-based analyst and trading firm. We position against some of our peers in the advisory and training and events business in the following ways. We're entirely focused on commerce, that is retail, e-commerce, grocery, CPG. That's where we have decades of experience. And secondly, we certainly view ourselves as collaborators and partners to sustainability teams. But everything we do is through a lens of commercial and operational feasibility and viability. And thirdly, we're not really a media business. We're not covering daily news. We're working with members to identify high priority topics and going deep to understand what the risk or opportunity is. So let's get into it. I set the discussion up by saying I think that CPG commercial teams have a blind spot. When I open my LinkedIn feed every morning, and I'm guessing many of you have the same experience, I see retail media and artificial intelligence sometimes both at the same time. And there's no doubt those are essential topics that are already transforming the business of retailing and CPG. My simple suggestion to anybody who's listening to this is that relative to its importance, you ought to be getting familiar with some of the vocabulary, concepts, and especially the commercial implications of what's happening as it relates to what regulators are doing, what retailers are doing, what your peers are doing, and even what is happening in the technology and investment world. Because when you start to go looking for it, you'll see there's a lot on the horizon and a lot happening now, in fact, that unless you go looking for it, may be hard to see. Uh, I spent a lot of my career, as I described, in strategic foresight and focused on e-commerce, which was sort of an exponential trajectory in the industry. And the challenge with a lot of exponential change is it always feels subscale until very suddenly, seemingly, you can't ignore it. And when I went looking for what my next venture might be, the reason I'm doing this is I saw some similar exponential trends happening in the areas I'll describe here that, again, if you go looking for them, you see the rate of change And you can appreciate that if that rate of change is sustained, we're going to have a pretty fundamental shift at some point over the next 3, 5, I would say 10 years is actually uh, longer than it's going to take in some areas. But it's a moving target. It's not like this is a Band-Aid that's going to be ripped off and suddenly everything will be different. But I am saying that the same way that you read about retail media and AI in your daily LinkedIn feed, you'll be seeing those topics in addition to sustainability very soon. And this is not the first exponential change in the industry. If you recall, or if you were working in online grocery or e-commerce as I was circa 2010, it was just a few years after the smartphone was released. Online grocery was happening in some of the major metros in Europe, places like South Korea, but a huge percentage of the conversations I was having with my major CPG clients went something like this. It's not profitable. So is it really going to happen? And it's not incremental. And operationally, it's really hard. And they weren't wrong. In many cases, all of those concerns were accurate. And yet, it was inevitable because of changing consumer expectations, improvement of technology, overabundant venture capital that enabled very different business models than conventional retail models. And here we sit 15 years later, and it's not even a single business model now. It's 4 or 5 different segments of the industry. And my guidance to companies that I'm working with in this area is pretty similar. I'm not taking a stance about what you should do necessarily, but I am trying to prepare companies for the change that's on the horizon so that they can maximize the upside where there's upside and so that they can minimize the downside where there's risk. So I mentioned that I saw some exponential trajectories when I went looking in this area. And the first I saw, and frankly, the least interesting, but it's tough to ignore, especially in Europe, is just a huge proliferation of regulatory instruments. This is just one example focused in, packaging, but there is equally compelling regulation happening, again, largely in Europe, in areas like the claims that you can make about a product and its repairability, its carbon neutrality. Essentially, in addition to these packaging changes, anything that you say about a product's environmental impact is going to have to be substantiated or you're going to face significant fines. And some of our peers in the industry have already faced some of those penalties. I think more interestingly, there has been an acceleration in recent years of top tier retailers and consumer goods companies setting science-based targets. And I think we can all acknowledge making long-term commitments. These are often commitments on a time horizon of 2040 or 2050 is a different thing than taking action today. But when I started reading the climate transition plans and actually looking at some of the initiatives in progress, I will tell you there's more going on today, and some of these initiatives are accelerating than I think are widely understood. So let's take a minute and talk about some of the more notable initiatives and give you a flavor of what's happening here. The way I would characterize the shift that I'm seeing is when you think about the first phase of industry sustainability and climate action, a pretty significant percentage of it is sort of behind the scenes. That is, maybe a retailer shifts its energy source or its heating and cooling equipment. But most of what they were doing did not directly impact the customer experience and didn't have a major impact on ways of working between suppliers and retailers. But when you look at this sort of sample of initiatives among major retailers, mostly in the US, although I cherry picked a couple in Europe and Asia just for comparison. What I think you'll start to see is there's a growing shift from a focus on energy efficiency to fundamentally reinventing almost all aspects of the value chain and business model, from how we think about store design. And when I say store design, I mean the number of stores, the size of stores, assortment strategy, packaging, logistics, fulfillment, how we market and merchandise to the shopper, the kinds of data that we require or request to exchange with our suppliers, and how we're using our private label not only as a means to change the economics of a given category, but to offer more meaningful choice and raise the bar as it relates to some of these initiatives. I think when you look at these lists, Walmart's Project Gigaton is one of the better known. It's a very far-reaching initiative launched over a decade ago that directly engages suppliers to reduce emissions. Amazon has really been investing aggressively over the last 3 or 4 years. We recently ran a session on Amazon's Climate Pledge Friendly program and Compact by Design program. Those are both pretty directly related to sellers and vendors and increasingly visible to shoppers. Alibaba, we're not going to spend a lot of time on Alibaba, but they are also increasingly aggressively introducing programs that are a key part of how suppliers engage with their platform. They're certainly acting differently than some of their peers in that region, but there's a clear pattern across majors in these markets to set targets and increasingly to engage conventional functions across the business in hitting those targets beyond the conventional energy efficiency and related initiatives. And, I'm not going to clobber everybody with a vocabulary lesson today, but if there's one term that I think is worth really understanding because it's going to increasingly influence the industry's activity in this area, it is what's called Scope 3 emissions. There are essentially 3 scopes of emissions for any given company in any industry. Scopes 1 and 2 are essentially what you directly control, either the emissions from your own power consumption at the facilities that you own or from your own activities. And then there are what are called Scope 3 emissions, which come from your value chain, both upstream, that is from your suppliers and vendors, and downstream, your customers or end users. And the key thing to know is that whether you're a retailer or a CPG, roughly 10% of your total value chain emissions come from Scope 1 and 2, that is, what's within your own control, and 85 or 90% on average, your mileage may vary, come from the value chain. And so if you step back and you think about what that means, particularly when you listen to the retailers who are introducing climate transition plans that increasingly focus on Scope 3 emissions, it means they are looking upstream to their suppliers and starting to engage and request, and I expect soon will be requiring initially providing reporting on emissions, increasingly setting targets to reduce emissions, and increasingly providing guidance, if not requirements, for how to design products and packaging, laying out parts of the store and marketing and merchandising to shoppers to help them make lower carbon choices at the shelf. So just a few examples here so that you appreciate that this is not just my opinion. Amazon this year is going to require its suppliers, and I think it's important to parse what they mean by suppliers here. My understanding in speaking with Amazon and suppliers is that this is direct suppliers to Amazon for its own labels. But Amazon is going to require suppliers to share their carbon emissions data and set their own carbon goals. That's this year. I think that pattern of setting the bar highest for your own labels, you'll also see happening with Walmart and Target in ways that I can describe. But my expectation is this is sort of the test and learn phase where they're going to see how much they can realistically achieve over what time frame on that limited scale where they have the most leverage, and then they're going to increase the leverage they try to exert on conventional suppliers year by year. In Europe, it's happening even more quickly in many cases. This quote you see from European Oatmeal is on the website of a company called Root Global, which is founded by some former executives of big European grocers who actually started a company, a technology company oriented to the industry to help through advanced analytics estimate product level emissions and decompose the drivers of those emissions, whether it's ingredients and materials used, packaging, where you're sourcing the materials from, logistics, you name it. But that kind of intelligence is increasingly of value to the industry. And then here's some of what Target is saying. This is directly from some of their investor reporting. Many retailers you'll see are prioritizing the suppliers that represent some majority of their spend. Ahold, for example, in its climate transition plan released in December 2023, talks about setting some new requirements for suppliers representing 70% of its sales. And you can see they're in this case requiring those suppliers that fall into that segment to set science-based targets, scope 1 and 2. And then I think you'll find over the next few years that's going to broaden to include scope 3, where the majority of the focus is. You'll also see Target is highlighting they've got programs that are both increasing access and guiding shoppers. I would tell you, when you walk the aisles in many of these stores, you'll see very inconsistent execution of some of these programs. But month by month, quarter by quarter, I think you're starting to see a stronger and stronger presence in both in-store and online on the shopper-facing side of how retailers like Target, like Amazon, like Walmart are showcasing the availability and helping shoppers choose these things. And so, when I think about how customer experience and ways of working between retailers and brands are evolving, I just want to highlight a few of the things that, again, until I really went looking for them, I don't think were particularly obvious. On the consumer-facing side, and really my focus is where retailer decisions are visible to consumers. This one's not widespread yet, but as just one proof point, Sprouts, the fast-growing North American specialty grocer, when it announced its or released its sustainability report last year, it talked about its shift to a smaller prototype. And part of the rationale for a smaller prototype, there's a lot of reasons that a retailer might introduce a smaller prototype. There's been a huge shift to smaller formats and infill stores over decades, but they highlighted its compatibility with their climate plan because smaller stores are lower emission. And I think that's one quick example of what you will start to see seeping its way into almost every decision that a retailer makes at the strategic level, in the sense that they're asking, is this going to get me closer to or further from the commitment that I've made or the regulations that I am going to have to meet by a certain point? Store experience that is coming to life in a lot of ways. Again, as an example, there's been an increase in industry collaboration and coalitions around refillable and reusable packaging. In France, there's pending legislation to require stores over 400 square meters to dedicate 20% of their selling space to reusable packaging by 2030. So if you think about what that means, there's more nuance to that legislation, but if you think about what it means at a high level, there's no question that some of the behavioral changes that we have tried to introduce and shift shoppers to, not just in this area, in many areas over the evolution of the last few decades, this is another area where it's going to have huge impacts on shopping behaviors. Channel mix, this is another interesting one. When you look at Mars and their net zero roadmap, Mars, by the way, is one of the examples that I keep citing because they've announced an investment of $1 billion, roughly 1% of annual sales, that they're deploying over the next 3 years to accelerate their net zero roadmap. And in that roadmap, they talk about their growing support of digital commerce, because on a per order basis, the footprint of an online order is lower than the footprint that is the climate footprint of a brick and mortar order. And so again, this is not the kind of thing that is a Band-Aid getting ripped off or a switch getting flipped. It is another consideration into these long-term strategic decisions about where do I play and how do I win, that you increasingly are seeing both retailers and brands including in the thinking at a level that just surprised me. Selection, when you look at this growing focus on Scope 3, Kroger did its first Scope 3 inventory in its most recent report. Sprouts did a Scope 3 inventory last year. And Sprouts actually disclosed they did it at a product level. That is, they worked with a partner to analyze their entire assortment and its climate footprint at a product level. And they didn't say anything more than that. But if you read between the lines, and you look at the targets and you look at where a retailer's emissions are concentrated, upstream, Scope 3, and you look at their increasing interest in more granular visibility into product level emissions, I think it becomes increasingly evident that this is going to be a consideration when a merchant is thinking about, do I invest more in this subcategory, and between this item and this item, all else equal? And again, don't get me wrong, and we'll talk about this. I'm not suggesting on any level this is a more important factor than product quality, effectiveness, price, convenience. Those are all essential parts of the value equation, and they're not going away. What I am suggesting is this is becoming a consideration, and in some cases a tiebreaker, and its importance may grow. It may be weighted more disproportionately over the coming years. Private label emphasis. All I want you to take out of this discussion today is, if you look at, in particular, what Walmart is doing, but Target as well, and Amazon, in fact, all of them have invested in their own they're intended to be bar-raising own labels that are more sustainable. Amazon has Amazon Aware. Walmart is not necessarily creating a separate brand, but with the Great Value brand, they have been introducing packaging and in some cases products like compostable single-use cutlery, where they couldn't find a supplier to offer a national brand. And so I think you're going to increasingly see the retailers try to set the bar with their own labels to encourage competition from their suppliers. And in fact, especially when you look at packaging, you'll see they're setting more aggressive targets for themselves. And in many cases, Walmart, for example, with their circular connector program, they're trying to share the learning with their supplier base so that lessons they've learned about how to, reduce packaging, right size and lightweight in ways that are commercially viable and acceptable to consumers. Those insights are increasingly available to suppliers. We're going to come back and talk a little bit about customer-facing impacts and the value proposition to consumers. But that is an area that I think is a fast-moving target in many ways. What we know is that from data provided by the NYU Stern School of Business and Circana, formerly IRI, roughly 17% of CPG sales in the most recently available data come from products marketed as sustainable. And according to their data, on average, they command a roughly 28% premium. And I think that suggests there's clearly a market for quote unquote sustainable products. I think it also tells you 17% is arguably not mainstream, and it certainly has not lit the world on fire, in the sense that while it continues to outpace the growth of products not marketed as sustainable, when you dig into what the companies that are making the most aggressive changes to their current portfolio, or where I spend a fair amount of my time looking at the companies that are being started today and are baking in these assumptions about the future from day one, the value proposition to consumers is really evolving quickly. So we'll talk about that. And as I hope you took out of the discussion about these different retailer initiatives, the retailers are increasingly requiring, data about corporate and, in some cases, product level emissions. It's increasingly impacting their buying criteria and assortment strategies. Packaging, as I think everybody understands, is a growing factor. Logistics is becoming a growing factor. Order quantities, where the product is going to be located, whether they prefer fulfillment from store or a distribution center. These are all increasingly influenced by some of these climate commitments. Let's talk about another hockey stick that I saw, which, if you knew me in my days at my last analyst business, this is basically what led me to e-commerce and online grocery, following the money. And what I mean is, I went looking at where the venture investment was concentrating in companies that were oriented to retailers and brands. And I did the same thing when I was trying to decide where should I go focus my professional effort over the next few years. And I was candidly stunned to see cumulatively $20 billion has been invested almost entirely over the last 5 years. This data set goes all the way back to 2014, but you can see the huge acceleration over the last several years into technologies and service providers that are either exclusively or primarily seeking retailers, e-commerce companies, or consumer brands as their clients. And their business model is not necessarily all about lowering emissions, but that is part of their value proposition. So if you can see behind that sort of fade on the right, that's a drone from a company called Zipline, which is one of 4 companies that Walmart is in active pilots with for drone delivery. And this is just one example, but if you're like me, you may remember Jeff Bezos a decade ago going on 60 Minutes and telling the world, drones are the future of delivery. And they had these noisy drones that could barely carry more than a pound or two. And I think, many observers and myself viewed it as a PR stunt to hype Amazon as an innovative, sort of forward-looking company. And a decade later, as I've done more and more research and analysis in this area, and I look at projections from the World Economic Forum as one example that show online commerce is projected to grow by roughly a third over the next, 6 years at this point, between now and 2030. And without intervention, there's going to be a roughly proportional corresponding increase in congestion and emissions. And so when I look at the capital flowing into sort of next generation last mile logistics solutions like drones from Zipline or Wing, which is a Google subsidiary, or DroneUp, there's more of these than you may realize. I'm not suggesting that drones are going to be the dominant mode of delivery for online ordering. On no level am I suggesting that. What I am suggesting is it makes more sense in the current and anticipated retail context, and especially in denser urban areas in some cases, than I would have anticipated the last time I thought about this, which was a decade ago. And so when you start to look at where this investment is concentrated, it really spans the value chain. I think, when you look at the CPG side of the industry, there is incredible investment in inputs, materials, ingredients, agriculture. Scope 3 to the brands is all about those inputs. And that is part of my focus here, but not as big a focus as what is increasingly visible to the retailers and ultimately to consumers. And so when you look at the product manufacturing and operational side of the industry, there is also huge investment in new brands. I've seen 2 waves of venture capital investment in and around CPG broadly. The first wave was purely in technology to support the big incumbents. That is, after the introduction of smartphones in the early days of online grocery, there was a lot of enterprise technology oriented to retailers and brands. The second wave has been in new brands, challenger brands. And this, 2.5 billion new brands bucket here, I'll describe the kind of companies that you find in there, but they often have alternative proteins or some other explicitly different approach to product formulation, packaging, logistics, fulfillment, you name it. with the premise that, that is a more commercially viable way of building a brand and operating a company over the next few decades. And when you listen again to companies like Mars, they and others are including a company's footprint in their M&A diligence. So if you're an investor funding a new CPG company that you hope is going to sell to one of the majors, increasingly you need to be mindful that they are going to prefer to acquire a company that, again, gets them closer to their target versus further from it. Food waste is just an incredibly massive topic that is becoming more visible within the industry and beyond the industry. Globally, the food system is roughly a quarter of all emissions, which was surprising to me. And about a third of those emissions come from food waste and loss. Most of that actually happens at the household level, but a material percentage of it happens at retail. And there's a lot of technology, some of it novel ways of preserving products that are perishable, but more and more of it oriented to helping sell more of what we would otherwise waste is getting a lot of investment and retailer traction. Of course, transportation and logistics is a big area of investment. Of course, packaging, resale, recycling, and lastly, administration. I mentioned that company Root Global, and it's got peers. I'll just jump. I'm not going to go through any of the detail here because there's a lot of detail. But what you can find on decarbonize.co is this entire taxonomy of roughly 30 subcategories of technology, which contain roughly 400 venture-backed solution providers, are all introducing technology or solutions that plug into the existing retail and consumer product business models, but are intended to get a company closer to its target. So we don't have time to unpack some of these subcategories, but if you're trying to get a sense of where is the capital flowing, you can start to see it here. And then everybody loves Illumiscape. Again, I'm not picking winners here. I'm not talking about any of these companies individually, but I think it's eye-opening when you go poke around some of the websites of these companies listed here just to see there's an entire ecosystem, not all of it successful. Some of these companies, I have to maintain this pretty carefully because like any early stage technology sector, some of these companies come and go. But there is a large and growing ecosystem that is almost invisible, I think, to the people within the industry that are looking for technology and service providers, because these companies aren't really marketed to the sustainability teams because the end users are not sustainability in many cases. And the conventional functions, sales, marketing, product development, you name it, are also not necessarily looking for enabling technologies that do these things. So part of what we're trying to do is just identify and organize that universe and, help companies build short lists of who might be worth understanding better. I want to talk a little bit about how to think about where your category sits on a maturity curve, or what the speed or impact might be depending on what category or categories your company makes. When I was doing advisory in the early days of e-commerce and online grocery, this was one of the biggest topics that we talked about. That is, books had already migrated to e-commerce. So the question was, is health and beauty going to come next? Are soft drinks ever going to move? And I did a similar analysis in this world. And there's an important concept that I discovered that I think is important for all of us to understand, which is there are really two macro determinants, and probably more than two, but two that I think are worth internalizing that are going to influence commercial outcomes in your category. And the first is carbon intensity. That is, if you are in a category that contributes significantly to emissions, you're going to see growing pressure from low carbon competitors and alternatives. And as you've already seen one example, and I'll show you others, retailers may begin, not all retailers, but they may begin to make decisions not to carry items that are disproportionately high emission. The second factor are climate sensitive products. Those are products whose yield or quality are sensitive to higher temperatures and extreme or volatile weather. And when you listen to Walmart's EVP of sustainability, Kathleen McLaughlin, this is one of the factors that she talks about is already impacting their supply chains. I think a huge percentage of what we've covered so far is all about what retailers and brands are doing to limit emissions today and in the future. But there's this flip side of the coin, which is there's a certain level of emissions that are baked in, and it's already disrupting yields and quality in different categories. I interviewed the owner of a family-owned and operated olive oil company who explained the 85% reduction in supply in that category last year was largely due to volatile weather. Similar, but not quite as extreme effects in other categories like wine. And so, I'm highlighting this analysis that McKinsey did only as an indication of where carbon intensity is concentrated and to highlight what you're already seeing certain retailers say and do. Again, mostly in Europe, where the activity is further on the adoption curve. But as I'll show you, some of what's happening is not limited to Europe. Excuse me. So Lidl, this is such a fascinating timeline to me. Like many retailers, they introduced their own plant-based lines of product. They introduced theirs about 3 years ago, but a year ago they publicly announced an intention to cut back on meat sales, which I can't think of too many cases in retail history where a retailer telegraphed, we are actively trying to transition or manage the decline of a category. And I think if you followed the plant-based meat category at all, you know that it's faced all kinds of hurdles and setbacks. Some of the bigger names Beyond and Impossible have faced slumping sales and some layoffs. And a few of the factors that many observers point to are the product is more expensive. And when you look at what is happening in this Lidl timeline, a few months after they made the public announcement, they placed their plant-based private label side by side with meat. And then in the fall, they placed it at parity or below. And I mentioned, this is what's happening at one retailer in Europe. But again, when you listen to Kathleen McLaughlin at Walmart, this quote is another that I keep coming back to. We all know about the 80-20 rule. In emissions, it's like 99-1. You don't need to measure every item to know it's beef, it's dairy, it's electronics. We know what they are. And so Walmart isn't on no level as aggressively trying to manage the decline of sales of animal products. But I do think it's notable that Walmart is highlighting it at that category level. I also think, I had a great discussion with the founder and CEO of a company called Carbon Cloud, which is another one of these product level climate footprinting and labeling software companies. And his view is we've already had a few decades to try to convince everyone to become vegetarian or vegan. It hasn't happened and it is unlikely to happen, which is why these category level pronouncements are too broad a brush to paint with if we're trying to lower emissions by guiding shoppers to different choices. So I don't have the answer. I don't know where this is going to play out. I do see a lot of interest and again, bumpy performance of really three categories of alternatives: plant-based, cultivated, and precision fermented. And those are three areas that we're tracking. But this is an area in just one category that you're going to see, I think, ongoing interest and innovation. And then again, I think you're starting to see some brands play offense in aisle, increasingly visibly marketing and branding along climate and sustainability messaging. Now, this is not the dominant or the prevailing approach, and I could have included sort of a real-time example that's playing out right now with a brand called Neutral. It's a milk brand, animal-based milk, and the neutral in their brand is about carbon neutrality. They just went through a rebrand, and they talk pretty openly in their public commentary about learning from their first phase of market feedback. And they're actually deprioritizing the climate and sustainability messaging, although they're not abandoning those, attributes of the product on any level. But they are de-emphasizing those and increasingly emphasizing some of the fundamental elements of the product's taste, nutritional profile, and so on. I will say, as I mentioned, on one side of the equation, we have disruptions to supply chain, impacts on yield and quality. On the other, we have carbon intense products that are, keeping retailers and brands from hitting their targets. And so all of that is to say, I think at a very high level, you can start to locate your category in one of these quadrants to start to get a view of what industry activity is going to look like in your category. That is, the higher you are in terms of carbon intensity, again, as examples, meat and dairy, you are going to see more VC activity and new brands in lower carbon alternatives. That is about this idea of mitigation. Two big words among climate and sustainability practitioners are mitigation and adaptation. And that's a simple way to think about these two axes. If you're in a carbon intense category, the industry is going to be under increasing pressure to lower emissions, mitigate the emissions. If you are in a climate sensitive category, that is, you're going to have a tough time producing at the same quantity or quality that the world has come to expect. You're going to have to adapt and become more resilient. by simplifying and ruggedizing your supply chain. A category that might fall into that is something like beer. And then there are categories that are, going to face real interesting evolution, like chocolate and coffee. Those are two categories, neither of which is as high emission as meat and dairy, but are higher than many other categories. And they are also fairly susceptible to higher temperatures and volatile weather. And so the speed and impact of change and the texture of change is coming on both dimensions in those categories. So ultimately, I'm starting to conclude that the viability zone, if you're in consumer products, sits at the intersection of commercial viability and climate viability, which is obviously not a breakthrough concept. But, what it means is you are in a category or you have an offering in a category that is low or lower carbon. You are, through supply chain ruggedization, better able than your peers to provide surety of supply. And thirdly, you have a winning value proposition in the ways that I'll describe. So I sort of stole my own thunder previously by talking about this data from Circana and NYU. And there will be an update from those two organizations over the next few months that I'm looking forward to. But my conclusion remains, as I said earlier, they're growing quickly, but they haven't won over the mainstream. And I think the conventional wisdom, and when you speak to not only professionals in the industry, but many consumers, there's this sort of well-documented intent and behavioral gap. That is, if you survey people or poll them, they'll tell you, oh, I'm willing to pay more. It's a top three consideration when I'm deciding what to buy. Is the product sustainable or better for the planet? And then when you look at the data, it's trending that way, but on no level is it that way today. And I think this is, again, where you see really quickly evolving views of what the value proposition looks like and corresponding investment in R&D and innovation. If you're not familiar with Notco, this is a company that I highlight because if you look at what I've boxed here, they talk about product superiority is their passion. And that's what they lead with. So obviously the brand is a challenger brand. It's sort of defined by what it isn't. But when you look at what they're doing from a product formulation perspective, they are defining success as being not just at parity, but a better product on factors like taste, nutritional profile. So this is why I think what you're seeing increasingly is when you study what the recently funded emerging brands are doing from a, what category do I enter? How do I formulate my product? How do I package it? How do I think about distribution strategy? Not all of them, but a growing number of them are designing products and business models that fire on most or all of these cylinders. And so, to close the discussion today, I would tell you, I think this is a vast simplification, but I find it helpful for thinking about, where are we and where are we headed? I think sustainability within the industry, it's obviously not new. It's been happening for decades. But I would characterize the first phase as, contextually, when we look at the world around us, it was all an abstract concept. And we didn't see some of the material impacts in our personal lives or in our businesses. The impacts were subtle. And contextually, the way that regulators and industry dealt with it were through incentives. It would be great if you did this, and here are some, subsidies or other credits. On the consumer side, very motivated, very loyal, but pretty niche. On the retail side, beginning to make long-term pledges, sort of developing high-level plans, but most of the action was backstage and concentrated in areas like energy, efficiency, and transportation. And on the brand side, specialty, niche, sort of corresponding to the consumer. I think where we are right now is the climate impacts are increasingly obvious. You see real-time impacts on port capacity and throughput. You see other supply chain disruptions that are impacting surety of supply and cost inputs. Mainstream interest is growing, but expectations for the moment exceed available choices, and so that intent to behavior gap remains. I think the retailers are beginning to introduce more targeted, what I call on-stage action, that is marketing and merchandising initiatives. If you go to Amazon's site or open their app, they're a leading indicator. You will see sustainability features called out on every landing page, homepage, search result page, detail page, and those badges, we know, increase traffic 10% on average. So you're going to see the retailers continue to invest and experiment with those kinds of customer-facing on-stage initiatives. I think you're also starting to see on the brand side, climate-forward challenger brands emerging. And when I say climate-forward, I don't necessarily mean in their positioning and messaging, although there are a growing number of those. I really mean if you peel back the onion and look at the decisions they're making about the category they're targeting, ingredients, materials, formulation, packaging, etc. They, as I describe, are competing on those factors along with product superiority. That's where I think we are today. Where I think we are headed is to a world where it's not just obvious the impact this is having on the business, it's actually starting to be a topic of discussion in earnings calls. That is, here's why we missed our number, or I hope, here's why we exceeded our target. And when I say target, I don't mean emissions target, I mean earnings. I think the regulatory levers are evolving to include not just incentives, but a growing number of requirements. In some cases, telling us what we can't do at all. I do see growing coalition building and consortiums that are trying to bring industries seat at that table as a voice so that the solutions that we land on are practical. And I think that's encouraging to see because so much of this is non-competitive or pre-competitive. And I think on the retailer and brand side, I'm not going to run through each of these impacts, but the same way that the growth of e-commerce and online grocery had implications for essentially every aspect of the business model, pack configuration, price pack architecture, new product development and innovation, packaging, branding, marketing, this is going to be a factor in all those decisions. So to summarize, I'm probably going to go a minute or two beyond the 60 minutes I had planned, but I hope having listened to this, you start to get the sense that while it may not feel like it, regulatory action, industry action, venture capital is accelerating in this area, and the activity is shifting from things that you and I can't see as suppliers to the retailer or as consumers to things that are increasingly hard to ignore. And this is really driven by the growing focus on Scope 3, which is all about aligning the value chain upstream and downstream, which is why so many retailers and brands are engaging their suppliers and customers in these areas and trying to align on ways of working. And I think almost everything is going to be affected in some way, but it's not going to affect every category or brand at the same speed or with the same magnitude. It depends in large part on what do you make and how do you make it. But I think, if you're planning for the next decade of success at your company and in your career, it's a good time to start to pay attention to what's happening in this area. And ultimately, in my observation, as I went looking at, how is the industry approaching this, I think part of the challenge is most commercial teams are unaware of almost everything I just covered. That's not fair to many teams. So I'm not saying nobody is paying attention or doing anything, because there's a lot that's inspiring. But I had 100 conversations before I decided to do this, and many companies and commercial teams view this general topic as uninteresting and irrelevant, which is why I'm really focused on material that is oriented to people in commercial roles. I think a lot of what you can find out there is abstract and specialized and industry agnostic. And again, we're really focused on grocery and CPG, where we have domain expertise and understand the business model. And thirdly, I think part of what I really am enjoying about this work is there is, just as there was in the early days of e-commerce and digital commerce, really intellectually curious people that are willing to try things and learn, and importantly, learn with their peers. And so, we've got an approach to helping accelerate awareness, understanding, and positive outcomes in this area that is pretty economical. And so if you think there would be benefit from insights and training or joining a peer network working in this area, our whole mission is helping you build in-house commercial advantage as this industry transition really accelerates and changes the work of retailing and CPG. So we almost came in on time. I appreciate anyone that stuck around for another minute or two beyond what was scheduled, and really appreciate your time. If you have questions or feedback, I would love to hear from you, and I'm pretty easy to reach. Keith at decarbonize.co. And if you're in the live audience at the moment, you can use the chat to pose any questions that you've got for me now. Otherwise, thanks so much for listening. Have a great day, and be in touch if I can be of help.